I accidentally turned this homework exercise from Ryan Leach into a nearly 5-minute long orchestral overture in a romantic style. Now, it's certainly no masterpiece, but how did this happen? And why did I make a whole video about it? Stay tuned and hopefully you'll learn a few things along the way that you can apply to your own compositions. A little while ago, Ryan Leach posted a video for beginning composers on his YouTube channel, outlining a simple method of harmonizing a theme with major and minor chords. He included a little homework exercise along with it, inviting viewers to choose major and minor chords to suit this melody. By the way, if you're fairly early on in your journey in music composition, I highly recommend Ryan's channel. He not only knows what he's talking about, he makes the topics he discusses easy to understand, plus he seems like a really just nice, laid-back guy. And no, he didn't sponsor this video, I just like his channel. Being the overachiever I like to think that I am, I decided to write not just one, but 2 harmonizations of this simple theme, one in C major and one in A minor. But I wanted to use more than just major and minor block chords to harmonize it, so I wrote both versions as full 4-part chorales, including inversions, 7th chords, temporary tonicizations, and so forth. Here's the C major one. And here's the A minor one. By the way, if you're wondering how I went about harmonizing these, I have a whole series of videos on 4-part harmony that you can check out up here. Now, after I wrote these, I thought I'd just put them in a nice simple ternary or ABA form. In other words, the C major theme, followed by the A minor theme, followed by the C major theme again. But the C major harmonization has this sort of noble quality, so I thought, you know what, I should orchestrate this with lower brass, strings, and timpani. Well then, of course, I had to orchestrate the minor harmonization, and I did so quite differently because it had quite a different character. Then I repeated it with a bigger orchestration, but that meant that I needed a transition from the major section into the minor section, and after that I needed a transition back into the major section. Then I realized that it really needed an introduction and an ending. And hey presto, I had an overture. Now, as I said earlier, this little overture isn't particularly great music, to be honest. And I wrote it in a hurry. I sketched out these harmonizations on a Friday evening and finished the whole overture after work on the following Monday. It's written in a romantic style that composers don't even really use anymore, and honestly, it was intended more as a sort of fun exercise or even a joke than anything else. So, if it's not that great, why would I even show it to you? Well, there are a few reasons. First, I had previously made a video about orchestrating four-part harmony and wanted to show you a real, or at least somewhat realistic example where I'd done exactly that. Secondly, a lot of composers have no trouble writing out an 8 or 16 bar melody, but then aren't sure where to go from there. I wanted to show you one way of producing a full-length piece from one 16 bar melody. Thirdly, and most significantly, to generate those transitions I mentioned earlier, and the introduction and the ending, I used a number of transformations of the original melody that you might find useful in your own compositions. In fact, every single melody or counter melody in this piece is derived somehow from that original 16-bar theme. You may find that difficult to believe, but later in this video I'll show you exactly how I did that by looking at a bunch of different types of transformation in detail. Fourthly, when I was showing this overture to a fellow composer, he thought that the structure and the transformations were really interesting and thought that you might learn from them too. And lastly, I'm planning to do a series of videos on analysis soon, and I thought this might tie in nicely by showing how you can work backwards, fleshing out your own piece from an academic form. So, first, we'll talk about the orchestration of the themes, and then how to make transitions, and finally how to transform themes into transitional material to make it all come together into a single cohesive piece. And at the very end, we'll hear the entire overture start to finish. The harmonizations I wrote sounded like those that were typical of the mid-Romantic era, around the middle of the 19th century. So I decided to orchestrate this for a full symphony orchestra that would be typical of that time. That is, 3 of each woodwind, 4 horns, 3 trumpets, 3 trombones, tuba, timpani, 4 percussionists each playing a single instrument, harp, and of course strings. Now, for the classical purists out there, I do realize that the harp was not a very common instrument in the orchestra at that time. Furthermore, I'm assuming 4 pedal timpani, which weren't even invented until the 1870s and not widely available until the 20th century. I'm assuming valve horns and valve trumpets, whereas a lot of composers at the time were still writing for natural horns and trumpets, or even a mixture of both. And I did take some of the instruments outside of the ranges that were typical of the time. The bassoons, flutes, and piccolos all go up to a top C. That's fairly common for the late Romantic era, but not typical of the sort of mid-Romantic era when this piece sounds like it was written. Still, any modern orchestra playing Romantic-era pieces would have access to all these instruments and be accustomed to playing these ranges, so I figured this wasn't a huge deal. So, let's take a look at the orchestrations of these two themes. I talked about most of these techniques in my video on orchestrating four-part harmony, so feel free to watch that if you haven't already. First, let's look at the orchestration of the A theme. In the first 8 bars, the 4 parts are distributed top-down to the strings. The basses double the cellos on the bass line an octave down, which was a very common practice in the Romantic era and is still fairly common today because it works really well. In the brass, in the first 8 bars, the first and third horns double the first violin to the unison on the melody, and the second trombone doubles the melody an octave down. The second and fourth horns double the second violins, the first trombone doubles the violas, and the bass trombone doubles the cellos. The timpani are playing on the sort of offbeats when the melody is holding a sustained note, so that the melody and accompaniment aren't competing for attention. And finally, the tuba plays a mixture of the bass line and the timpani part. In bars 5 through 7 of the theme, the timpani are silent because there are quite a few chords in there where none of the 4 drums can play a chord tone, and I'm trying not to make the timpanist frantically change the pitch of their timpani constantly. In the second 8 bars, I decided to change things up just a little, because it was starting to feel a little stale. The second half of the theme uses the same instruments, but with some slight variations. I took the violins and violas up an octave. I had the first trombone take over, doubling the melody of the original octave, going up near the end of the 8 bars to a top C, which is quite forceful on a trombone. The second trombone doubles the second violins at the original octave. The first and fourth horns double the violas in octaves. The second horn doubles the bass line an octave up. The third horn is actually playing a mixture of different lines, and the cellos, basses, bass trombone, tuba, and timpani continue playing the bass line as they did in the first half of the theme. The effect is to broaden the sound and to make the melody a bit more forceful and grand without really altering the texture. This is what the entire statement of the A theme sounds like. Listen for the subtle change I mentioned in the second half of the theme. Now let's look at the orchestration of the B theme. By the way, in most pieces, the B theme would be a completely different melody, but in this case it's just a different harmonization of the same melody. This orchestration is a little more interesting than that of the A theme. The upper strings and harp just play block chords without really paying attention to the original counterpoints. The strings use a simple repeated rhythm, played portato. However, the melody is taken by a solo clarinet, providing that sort of sad, nostalgic sound that I'm going for. In bars 5 through 7, the second clarinet and 2 bassoons come in, playing the original 4-part counterpoint, while the strings continue to play block chords. The cellos come in for just a bar to accentuate that G, G-sharp, A motion, which is a special moment with the false relation of G in the melody against G-sharp in the bass. In the second half of the melody, the second clarinet is replaced by the first oboe. The reason is that I wanted that plangent sound of the oboe on that appoggiatura in the alto voice. In bar 14, I used a little trick to make the oboe transition back to the second clarinet. The oboe decrescendos from mezzo forte to piano, and the second clarinet crescendos from piano to mezzo forte. To the listener, since the instruments are very close by each other, it sounds like the oboe sound is gradually turning into a clarinet sound. Mahler uses this all the time, for example, to make it sound like a muted horn is smoothly transitioning to an open horn, but without the hornist having to take their hand out of the bell, which would alter the pitch of the notes. Throughout this whole section, the harp is mostly playing block chords, echoing the general shape of the melody at the top of the right hand, and the bass line at the bottom of the left hand. And the double basses are just playing the occasional pizzicato note to accent the beginning of each phrase. The other thing to look at here are the dynamics. The upper strings and harp are purely background, just fleshing out the chords, so they stay pianissimo the entire time. However, the winds have actual contrapuntal lines, and are supposed to be in the foreground, so they have hairpins to shape their lines. In this mock-up, I've actually marked the solo clarinet as mezzo piano instead of piano like the rest of the winds. In a real orchestra, I just mark it piano with a solo designation, which would tell the conductor and the player that the solo line should be brought out above the rest of the ensemble. But unfortunately, my notation software doesn't know what solo means, and so I've just marked them up by one dynamic level. I should also mention that some of you may be concerned about the winds breathing in this passage, since some of them are playing for 12 or even 16 bars without a marked rest. But don't worry, a wind player will take a breath if they need one, and they'll try not to take one in the middle of a slur. There are plenty of places where a player could take a breath here. For example, here, or here, or here. With all that in mind, this is what the first statement of the B theme sounds like. For the second statement, which comes right after the first statement, I really wanted to amp up the emotional intensity, so I made it forte. And I put the theme in octaves in the violins, doubled by the flutes, piccolo, and first oboe. That way the melody really stands out. As Alan Belkin likes to say, orchestrate your dynamics. The first horn plays a simplified version of the melody. The second horn plays the alto line. The third horn and viola are doubled on the tenor line. And the cellos play the bass line. You may notice a bit of an imbalance here. Why do I only have one horn on the alto line when everything else is doubled? That's because it's mostly just an A pedal, which is also played in the bass line. So I didn't feel like I needed to double it further. Also, if you look at the horn parts in bars 6 through 8, they start to mix up the lines a little. So what about the remaining instruments? The double basses and contrabassoon are playing an elaborated version of the bass line. You can see that the E, D, C, B, A motion echoes the bass line, but has some intervening chord tones in it. Also notice that the rhythm of quarter, half, quarter echoes the upper string rhythm in the previous section, helping to tie the two sections together. Some of you more advanced orchestrators may be wondering how I can get away with a slur of an octave in this low register of the double bass. Wouldn't they have to either do some awkward double string crossing or a big obvious gliss or something? Unlike a violinist, a double bassist can't reach anywhere close to an octave in a single hand position. Well, the answer is no. This low A is an open string, so the bassist can play the upper A on the D string and not have to move their hand at all. The timpani are playing that pedal A for 5 bars, echoing the bass line and alto line until they switch to D in the 6th bar to better match the chords. And the last thing to cover is the harp, which is playing a simple arpeggiated version of exactly what it played previously, with the notes chosen to avoid excessive pedal changes, like not changing the F and G pedals at the same time since they're operated with the same foot. The 8th notes help to give the passage a sense of motion. However, since all the strings and horns are playing forte, the harp is going to be really hard to hear, so I doubled it with the bassoons, which are not loud, but the combination of harp and bassoon should be at least slightly audible against the rest of the ensemble due to the faster notes. The bassoons are dovetailing to give each player a chance to breathe. This does go up to a top C in the first bassoon, Nowadays, that's no big deal, but in the mid-Romantic era, orchestral players rarely had to go above a top A or maybe occasionally a B flat. Still, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not striving for full historical accuracy here. For the second half of the theme, I wanted to reach a local climax, so I brought in the first trumpets, playing that poignant line that the oboe was playing during the first statement of the theme, and I doubled it with the first and third horns in octaves. That top E is pretty high for the first horn, so it's going to get pretty loud and strident. The second and fourth horns take over harp doubling duties from the bassoons, because unlike the harp or bassoons, they can at least somewhat compete with the rest of the instruments that are playing. Since the horns are busy, the trombones take over the chord support duties from the first half of the theme. And finally, at the climax, I brought in the other two trumpets and the tuba just for a few bars. And we hear the crash cymbals for the very first time. Again, the first flute goes up to a top C, which would have been very unusual in the mid-Romantic era. A or maybe B flat was the generally accepted limit. But modern professional flutists are used to going up to at least a D, and I've seen Ligeti right up to a fourth octave F. Notice that the peak dynamic here, even at the climax, is forte, not fortissimo. Why? Because I'm saving that tutti fortissimo for the climax of the whole piece, which is right near the end. One other thing to notice is that I did include a very short one-bar transition from the first statement to the second statement in the form of an arpeggio in the violins and a timpani roll. A bit cliché, but it works. So here's what the one-bar transition and the second statement of the B theme sound like. As I mentioned earlier, I decided to write this piece using a sort of ternary form. But as I'm sure you can tell, if I just tacked the B theme right onto the end of the A theme, it would sound really out of place. So I needed a transition. I've heard it said that every part of a piece should either be going somewhere or should have clearly arrived somewhere. And I think this is where a lot of beginning composers struggle. How do I come up with a transition? What material do I use? First, let's talk about what needs to happen during a transition. A transition is a link between two sections of your composition. Transitions can be gradual or sudden or anywhere in between. And I use various different levels of transition in this piece. You usually want more gradual transitions than sudden ones. Otherwise, you're jerking your listener back and forth all over the place, which feels a bit like musical whiplash. It can also cause those sudden transitions to lose their impact. So, how can you make a gradual or a sudden transition? Let's think about the elements that you can vary in your music. First, volume. How loud is the music? Then motivic content, what themes or motifs are playing. Tempo, how fast is the music? Now, I don't mean how fast the actual notes are, and I don't even really mean the tempo marking. I mean the beats that a listener will perceive. How fast would you tap your foot to the music? Then orchestration, what instruments or families of instruments are playing? Harmonic rhythm, how fast are the chords or tonalities changing? Are you, on average, changing chord every quarter note, every bar? Then the actual rhythm, how fast are notes being played and what rhythms are being played? Tonality and key. What key, mode, pitch class set, or whatever is the music using? Textural density. How complex is the texture? Is it very clear and homophonic? Or are there lots of things happening at once? For example, a whole lot of counterpoint or polyrhythms. And finally, register. What ranges of pitches are playing? A more gradual transition will tend to be longer, or alternatively, will transition from a starting point to a destination that isn't very far away. Conversely, a more sudden transition will tend to be shorter, maybe even no time at all, or just a short rest, and will drastically vary a number of the items above. Let's look at two examples of transitions in this overture. First, we'll look at the transition from the end of the introduction into the beginning of the A theme. This is what it sounds like. What changed during this transition, and how long did it take? Well, the volume went from piano to forte. Motivic content? Well, we'll discuss later what it started out as, but it ended up with the A theme. The tempo was unchanged. The orchestration went from winds to strings, brass, and timpani. The harmonic rhythm was changing about every bar in both cases. The actual rhythm went from whole notes and half notes to quarters and eighths. The tonality stayed in C major. The textural density went from very clear, just whole notes, to slightly more dense, somewhat contrapuntal. And the register went from the middle range, around G3 to D5, to a lower range, C2 to E4. 5 of these categories have changed, and the only transition period is a brief caesura. So this is a pretty sudden transition. Now let's look at the transition from the A section to the B section. This transition takes 6 bars. So what changed here? The volume went from forte to piano with a decrescendo in the middle, so gradual. The motivic content changed from the A theme to the B theme, which actually are the same theme in this case. The tempo changed from a quarter note as 132 to a quarter note as 108, retardando, so gradually changing. In the orchestration, the winds drop out, then the brass and percussion drop out, then the lower strings drop out, so it gradually changes as well. The harmonic rhythm is unchanged. There are chord changes every bar. The actual rhythm started with 16th notes, but then at the beginning of the transition changed to 8ths and 16ths in that fanfare theme, then 8th notes in the strings, and then finally quarters and half notes, so it was a gradual change. The tonality changed from C major to A minor, but it was done via a modulation over 4 bars after a clear C major tonic chord. We had a B flat major and D minor chord start to destabilize a tonality, and then the E major chord clearly interpreted D minor as 4 in the new key of A minor. The textural density goes from quite dense to homophonic. The register goes from quite a wide range to a very narrow range, and it's mostly a gradual change. As you can see, even more categories change here than in the last example. In fact, the only thing that didn't change was a harmonic rhythm. But all these things change gradually, making this feel like a much less sudden transition than the previous one. Okay, so we've seen how to transition from one section to another, But that doesn't give us the actual musical material to use during those transitions. So what musical material should we use? Well, it's often a transformation of one of your themes, often the theme that came right beforehand. I should also mention that these transformations are very useful not just in transitions or development sections, but also in sections of your music when you've already arrived somewhere. There are many different types of transformation that you can perform on a theme, and I won't be giving you an exhaustive list. In fact, I'm not sure such a list exists. But I will give you several very common transformations that I've used in this piece. I should mention that while some of these are mutually exclusive, like augmentation and diminution, many of them can be and often are used together. Fragmentation is exactly what it sounds like, taking a theme and splitting it up into little bits called motives, which are usually only a few notes long. For example, let's consider the first 4 bars of the theme we've been looking at. This can be broken up into 3 motives. Notice that the FGE motive is the same rhythm as the EED motive. In fact, you'll find similarities like this all over good melodies, both at the large and small levels. For example, the second half of the theme starts with these same 4 bars, so that's a larger repetition and a clear reuse of these motives. In fact, this particular type of repetition in the second half of a theme is so common that it has a name, the period form. One example of how I've used fragmentation in the overture is in the first few bars. That ABC motive, which repeats 3 times, actually comes from bars 13 through 14 of the melody. Augmentation is just a fancy word for lengthening each note of the theme or motif, often but not always doubling the length. For example, we could transform bars 5 through 8 of the theme as follows. Here's the original version. And here's the augmented version. You may say, this is really slow and boring. How could you possibly use this? Well, let's check out bars 79 through 86 of the overture. Here's what they sound like. Does anything here sound familiar? If you're not sure, look at the double bass part and the 4th horn part. This is simply an augmentation of those 4 bars of the original melody that we just saw. I've just taken the final G down an octave. The key here is that there are other things going on while the augmentation is playing, in this case the tuba. That's why it works. Diminution is the opposite of augmentation, so decreasing the length of each note of the theme or motif. You'll often, but not always, reduce the length by half. I should mention that sometimes you won't reduce every note by exactly half, but the overall length would be reduced by half. For example, we could transform the first 4 bars of the theme as follows. Here's the original version. If we were to literally have every note value, it would look like this. But a more natural diminution might look like this. There are several examples of diminution in this overture, but I'll point out a couple. First, right after the A theme plays, I wanted a little fanfare in the trumpets to continue that noble quality, but change up the rhythm and orchestration a little. But what motif should I use for the fanfare? Well, let's look at the beginning of our 16-bar melody again. If we were to scrunch that down into a single bar instead of two, and then change the rhythm to eighth notes, we might get something like this. If you turn that into more of a fanfare rhythm, you get something like this. Similarly, if you were to take the first 4 bars of the theme and scrunch them down into just 1 bar, you might get something like this. And in fact, these 2 bars are exactly the fanfare melody that I've used in bars 30 through 31 of the overture. Here's another example. If we were to lay all the notes in the first 4 bars of the theme out, remove repeated notes, and make them all equal length, they would look like this. This theme is in C major. If we transpose those notes into A minor, they become this. Let's have another look at bars 79 through 80. Does this figure and the tuba look familiar? Intervallic alteration is exactly what it sounds like, altering an interval of the original melody, but otherwise keeping it intact. I haven't done this too much in this overture, but if you look at the first few bars, there's a subtle example. If you look at the 16th note figure in the cellos and basses in bars 5 through 6, it starts with these 4 notes. Well, this is just a highly compressed diminution of bars 13 through 14 of the original theme, just transposed into A instead of C. And the rest of the run is just arpeggios with a similar shape as those first 4 notes. However, if you go back and look at bars 2 and 3, the same run starts with these notes. So the 4th at the end has been changed to a minor 3rd. That's because the chord playing during this run is a diminished 7th, which contains an F sharp but no E. And in fact, most of the time when we use intervallic alteration, we're doing so to conform more closely with the accompanying harmony. Retrograde is another fancy musical term for just playing the notes of a theme backwards. The first 4 bars of our melody in retrograde would look like this. However, most of the time when we use retrograde, we'll change the rhythm, which, by the way, is another transformation that I'm not actually covering separately because it's so ubiquitous. Sometimes we'll make the rhythm a little more natural for the resulting line, or mimic the rhythm of the original melody. For example, this is the rhythm of the original melody, and it's also the same as the rhythm above, just displaced to the left by 1 quarter note. There are a couple of examples of retrograde in this piece, but I'll just point out one at the end of the introduction. Bars 5 through 6 of the melody are a simple descending scale, A, G, F, E. If you look at the second bassoon part, in bars 8 through 12 of the overture, you'll see this little bass line. As you can see, it plays A, G, F, E, F, G, A. And the second half of that bass line is simply the first part played backwards. I'll also point out that the first clarinet part in this section looks like this. If you compare this with bars 13 through 15 of the theme, you'll see that it's simply a rather large 7-bar augmentation. If Retrograde is playing a theme backwards, then Inversion is playing it upside down. In other words, where the original melody goes up, an inversion will go down by the same interval, and vice versa. For example, here are the first 4 bars of the theme again. An exact chromatic inversion would look like this. This example uses exactly the same major and minor intervals between each note that the original theme does, just in reverse. However, you'll often find inversions that are more approximate. This one still uses seconds and thirds in the opposite direction as the original theme, but it stays on the same scale, so sometimes it changes a minor interval to a major one and vice versa. Intervallic alteration is often used with inversions. For example, if we were to take the first 4 bars of the melody again and start the inversion on a C instead of an E, we would end up with this. Well, that's fine and all, but it would sound a bit more natural if we change that A to a G. To be honest, I've only really used inversion one place in this overture. The wind figures in bars 33 through 37 look like this. Now, this looks really complicated at first glance, but trust me, it's not. If we were to just stick all these notes on the same staff and eliminate all the duplicates, we'd get this. So where did this little run motif come from? Take a look at the last 4 bars of the theme. With a little intervallic alteration to fit the A minor chord that's playing at this time, we get this. Now let's do a diatonic inversion. What do we get? And now, with an intermediate A to tie the two together, we have the whole run. I simply put this in thirds, as follows. Then I sequenced it down by a step 3 times with the intervals altered slightly to fit the chords, used some dovetailing to ensure that the wind players had time to breathe, and ended up with this. By the way, can you guess where these whole notes in the first violins come from? You guessed it, it's an augmentation of that descending scale figure in the theme. Elision is simply the process of deleting excess material where it would be too repetitive. This is usually not a transformation of a theme itself, but rather a process that happens when joining 2 sections together. For example, Our theme ends with the following few notes. Let's say our next section started with this. If we were to play these right next to each other, that C major chord would be getting old rather quickly. So instead, we could get rid of one of the C major chords and elide the surrounding bars as follows. Here's an example of elision in the overture, due to a situation rather like the above. Our A minor theme ends with a big A minor chord, and our 4-bar transitional figure begins with an A minor chord. So I deleted the excess measure and just overlapped the 2 A minor chords. Here's what it sounds like. Interleaving is simply alternating notes or groups of notes from 2 or more motives, usually with some regular pattern like picking every other note from each motive. It's easiest to show this with a real example. In bars 75 through 78, in the second violin, I've interleaved the following 2 themes. We saw the first 6 notes earlier. They're just the first 6 notes of the theme transposed into A minor. The latter half of this is just an extension of the same thing, transposed down another third, but I took out the middle 3 notes, so again a bit of fragmentation. Interleaving these with a little chromatic alteration produces the following line. In each bar, the first note comes from the first motive, and the next 3 come from the second motive. Here's what that passage sounds like in context. Interpolation just means adding notes in between other notes, kind of like passing tones. Extension is just taking a small figure in the melody and repeating it or extending it in the same direction somehow. Let's look at the following passage, which should be pretty familiar by now. We've seen how bars 79 and 80 are constructed, and bar 81 is just a repeat of bar 79. But where did those notes in bars 82 through 86 come from? Take a look at the end of the theme. It looks like this. If we transpose that into F major, we get this. With a little intervallic alteration to suit the harmony that's playing at the time, we get this. Now let's look at this line. I tacked a C sharp onto the front, an extension of the D, E, F line, and I added an interpolation of an E between the F and the D. I also wanted to take that final G down an octave to that lovely low register on the tuba, so I extended the movement by thirds, starting with C, A, down to a low D before arriving at the G. And so we end up with this. So far, we've looked at the introduction, the A theme, the transition from the A theme to the B theme, and the B theme itself. But there's a little more left. There's quite a long transition from the B theme back into the A theme, and it uses a lot of the techniques that we've already talked about today. If you'd like a little practice analyzing these sorts of transformations that I've outlined, I'd encourage you to look at the section from bars 87 to 114 and see if you can figure out where all the melodic content comes from. First the trombones, then the clarinets, then the flutes and second oboe, then the piccolo and first oboe. In each case, the top instrument in the group is playing material that comes from our 16-bar melody in some way. I've put a link to the score and the MP3 for the overture in the description for this video. You can freely download them from my website. And that leaves only the final statement of the A theme and the ending. One thing that's nice to do at the end of a piece is to recap a bunch of ideas from earlier in the piece, and that's exactly what I've done. The first half of this A theme has three main layers. The full counterpoint from earlier in the piece, played by 3 trumpets and the first trombone. The fanfare theme, played by flutes, oboes, and clarinets. And an 8th note walking bass line, played by bassoons, cellos, and double basses. Then in the second half of the theme, the rest of the brass come in, and the violins come in, with a 4th layer of 16th note scales. I was thinking of Brahms' Academic Festival Overture when I wrote this part. Finally, the ending is a simple restatement of the second 4 bars of the theme, ending with a C instead of a G, making a simple descending scale that ends satisfyingly in the tonic of our home key. All right, after all that analysis, it's finally time for some music. So without further ado, I hereby present the Homework Festival Overture. So there you have it. That's how I accidentally transformed a 16-bar melody into a full orchestral overture. And I'd encourage you to practice these transformations and transitions by doing the same thing, but on purpose. Feel free to leave a comment with the transformations that you find most interesting or that you like to use in your own compositions. Have I missed some? Let me know. And if you write an extended composition with these techniques, leave a comment here and let me know about it. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please drop it a like to help others find it. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, consider subscribing to my channel so you get notified when new videos come out. So until next time, have a good one.